Well, it's that time of year again. The summer is drawing to a close.
Oh, yes.
It's back to school time, and we know here at yourspecialeducationrights.com that means that parents and students have a little anxiety perhaps going back to school.
Sometimes a lot.
And so we're going to be doing this segment on back to school. I'm Julie Swanson. I'm a special education advocate at yourspecialeducationrights.com.
And I'm Jennifer Laviano. I'm a special education attorney at yourspecialeducationrights.com. And Julie and I know from personal experience as well as professional experience that the start of the school year can be particularly difficult for students who have IEPs or 504 plans, and generally students who have disabilities. So we have some ideas that we've learned over the years are really helpful to prepare you and your child for the start of the school year.
And Jen, let's start off with the category of organizing yourself.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of ways that you can look at organizing yourself. But I think we're talking about that very logistical, practical standpoint of really what kind of folder, what kind of binder do I get to keep my child's school records in, perhaps schoolwork, emails that you shared with staff, discipline reports.
Right.
You know, get yourself a system by which you can be organized. And, you know, you're the best one to figure out how to do that. But it might even be that you buy a calendar. So if something happened on a particular day, you're able to write on the calendar, you know, X, Y, Z happened on this day. So organization is a really good way to start.
Organization is huge. And one of the things that Julie and I have talked about many, many times, and I don't want to sound negative or cynical here, but documenting what's happening with your child's education is a very important thing. I know I'm a lawyer, and so I have that perspective that you have to document things. But over time, there are going to be situations where maybe you and your school district don't agree or don't recall exactly what happened previously leading up to a service or a program. And so it's really important that you have kept records of your communications with the school district, and almost to a fault. I say keep everything. Keep the emails, keep the home school communication logs, keep everything. So it's important that if you're going to do that, you want to be organized. And one thing I saw a client do, and again, as Julie said, everyone knows what works for them in terms of an organizational system, but I had one client who literally had a 3-ring binder for each school year. So first grade, second grade, third grade, that they kept in a particular place in their house. And anytime there was a question about whether or not that had been in the IEP in second grade or in third grade, she could just pull up that binder for that year and we could go through, and it was really easy to find information. And I'll tell you, I think a system like that can really help you down the road, even just historically, to understand as you're looking at your child as they're aging through the educational system. Wow, you know, when that service was in place, I noticed that there was a lot more progress. It just is good to have that background. Don't you agree?
Oh, absolutely. Organization is really key. And in addition to binders, folders, or calendars, be organized in the sense that you know who your case manager is.
Yes.
Who is your child's case manager? Know ahead of time, how am I going to communicate with my school team?
Right.
Is it going to be through email? Am I going to have regularly scheduled team meetings with them? What kind of a communication system am I going to set up for the year? Even from a homeschool communication standpoint, but how you as the parent are going to communicate with your case manager.
And that can be especially tricky if your child is moving from an elementary school program to a middle school program or a middle to a high school program, because often the actual staff members who participated in the IEP meeting to plan for that coming school year may be different than the team that's actually working with your child. And so the person you met when you were planning the program in the spring may not be the case manager who's in fact handling the case. So when school starts, if possible right before school starts, but certainly when school starts, you want to reach out to who you believe the case manager is, by email preferably, and say, I understand that you're going to be the point person. Most children have a point person for the IEP, and are you the right person for me to communicate with about my questions? What's your preferred mode of communication? Is that email? Should I call you? You know, some schools have a form that, depending on the needs of the child and the age of the child, has, you know, every class that the student's taking with days of the week that the student themselves brings on Fridays for the teachers to check off how they did that week, if they're long-term assignments or short-term assignments. There are many, many ways of communicating with your school district, but you want to make sure from the beginning of the school year, what's our plan, how are we communicating, and can we do it consistently until and unless that system works against you in some way and you don't feel like it's working out.
And as you move forward, these are also things that can be put in place at your IEP team meetings prior to the start of a new school year. But if you haven't done that, it's never too late. And we're not suggesting that you should micromanage anything, but I think it's so important to have a plan in place. Who's my go-to person? How am I communicating with that person?
Right.
And having a system by which you're, documenting everything that's gone on in a way that works for you is a really good way to start. And so the next category of what we want to talk about is, and I think it's so important, Jen, is parent education. I think it's so important for you as parents to know that parent training is a related service under the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And if you're starting the school year and you don't understand how your child's IEP goals are written, or if you have well-written IEP goals, or you don't understand when you look at the document, oh my gosh, what does this even mean? There's room for parent training.
Right.
And so let's talk about that.
So parent training and counseling is a related service, as Julie said, under the IDEA. And it's not mandated for all children or all families. But basically what the IDEA says is that if a child needs for their parent to have training or counseling in what that IEP is or their disability is, then the school district's supposed to provide it through the IEP. So, and as an example, many parents are not educators themselves. And if you had a child who had significant needs and the school district was using a method with that child that you don't really understand at all,
right,
you might need somebody from the school district to train you on how to support that at home, so that you're helping in the assistance and the implementation of the IEP. So that is important. Any kind of parent education, what we do here at yourspecialeducationrights.com is part of that parent training and education that we're doing informally, but there's no reason it couldn't be part of an IEP. There's no reason that going to a conference on your rights couldn't be part of an IEP if you felt that you needed it in order for your child's IEP to be implemented appropriately. So it's a underserved area. I think it's overlooked a lot. It's unfortunately rare that I see IEPs that include parent counseling and training, and yet I see many families who would benefit from it.
Right. And, Jen, we could do a whole series and segment on how to write well-written IEP goals.
Right.
We're not doing a segment on that. But I would also suggest, if that's an area that you need to get more information for yourself, understanding how your child's IEPs are written and really knowing whether or not they're measurable, go out or go to your computer, go to Google, go to Amazon.com, and get a book on how to write IEP goals. This particular one, I believe we might even have this on our bookshelf series that will be up on our website at some point. But this one is just writing measurable IEP goals and objectives. This one happens to be by Barbara Bateman and Cynthia Herr. And again, there are others, but I'm just using that as an example, that if you feel that you need to have more information on understanding your child's IEP and how to write goals, there's so many books that you can buy.
Well, and that gets back to that, what are the first things you want to do when school is starting? Well, one thing you want to do is read your child's IEP. Pull it out again if you haven't read it since the last meeting you attended.
Right.
Make sure you understand what's in it. Make sure you understand what services are going to be provided, and really take a good hard look at it. And if you don't understand it, there are lots of different resources in many states to help you go through those complicated pages.
Right, and that speaks to what our next category is, and that is IEP-related issues, your individualized education program issues. And speaking to that, Jen, I can't tell you how many parents come to me and they'll say, I don't even know how to read this document. Well, most states, and please check with yours, usually have available, whether it's in a PDF online or it might be something they can mail to you, a side-by-side sort of analysis of the IEP, and it walks you through the document. You should check with your state to see if in fact that's something that you have available to you. The other option that you have under parent training is to contact somebody in your school team and say, I really need somebody to explain this to me.
Right.
So if that's a need that you have, don't be shy to get that underway.
No, and one of the things that we feel it's important to bring out is those IEP-related changes. Let's face facts. Many parents of children with disabilities are so busy running from appointment to appointment and with their day-to-day life of raising children and dealing with this complicated system that they have their end-of-the-year meeting. And then summer comes, and then, we all know how summer is, particularly with children, and you're running around, etc. And many parents don't really sit down to read that document until school's about to start. And sometimes they discover that there's a service they thought was going to be included that isn't, or a service that they understood to be something, but it's written in a different way. And so if you take a look at that IEP and you're surprised or confused, this is the time, not later, to ask about it. And if necessary, to say it's time for another IEP team meeting. And that can be especially true if there were changes in your child over the summer. So sometimes students are evaluated over the summer. You want to make sure that your school district has that evaluation. Sometimes you have different diagnoses that have come up over the summer. You might have medication changes, which you might need to bring to the school nurse's attention.
Student might have been hospitalized.
I mean, any significant change, positive or negative, in behavior, performance, diagnosis, etc., that has happened over the summer that your school district may not be aware of, it's important that they now have that information. And that may require reconvening the IEP team meeting.
Right. And yet, if there's going to be a change made to the IEP, you would want to call an IEP team meeting. But if it's something you just want to inform the team of, that you may not, nothing may change, you would just call a regular meeting too.
Absolutely. So, and in fact, further to the point, and we'll probably make this point more than once this evening, but further to the point Julie made earlier, there are some things for back to school preparation that would have been better done at the IEP meeting you had the previous school year. One example is, I think that having informal parent meetings, not IEP meetings, but those meetings where the parents and the team get together on a regular basis is a really good thing to put into your child's IEP. Monthly parent team meetings, bi-monthly parent team meetings, quarterly parent team meetings, whatever it is, because so often I see this, and I bet you do too, where parents go the entire school year with no clue that something either wasn't happening that they thought was happening, or something is happening that they had no idea was happening, and they didn't know about it until almost a whole school year has passed.
Right, so I guess the takeaway for me on that is that when you have an IEP team meeting this year, put some things in place for the beginning of the next school year, so you don't have to be sort of racing to do something because it wasn't a part of the IEP.
That's right. And it's important to remember that the federal law, the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, requires that you get information about your child's progress towards their IEP goals, and in some states goals and objectives, at least as often as the non-disabled peers are getting report cards or progress monitoring. And so your IEP, the child's IEP, should tell you how often you're supposed to be getting that information, but it's usually quarterly. It's not always quarterly, but it usually is. And so you want to be figuring out, am I supposed to get my first report on how my child's doing towards the goals and objectives in October, in November? That's a good thing to put on a calendar, like you were discussing earlier. I should be finding out how much progress we're making by X and such dates.
Right, but also to that point, you may also want to set up regularly scheduled meetings in addition to those quarterly or however often they are in your school district, where you can have more face-to-face meetings.
Right.
Also, if your child's behavior has changed over the summer at all, it may mean that you need to call a IEP team meeting to ask for something called a functional behavior assessment, which is
also known as an FBA.
Also known as an FBA, and it is an analysis of behavior.
Right.
And what's supposed to come out of that functional behavior assessment is a behavior intervention plan. Again, this is if there have been some significant changes in behavior that you believe are going to impact your child at school.
Right. And just sorry to interrupt you, but one point on this that I think is really important to make. Summer services, which many students with disabilities do receive, summer services are an area of a great deal of misunderstanding, to put it lightly, both by parents and school districts. And many parents are told that the standard for whether or not a child is entitled to receive what we call ESY, which is more alphabet soup, but extended school year services, which in English is summer services, is whether or not the student is going to regress over the course of the summer, so much so that recouping the progress they had made previously is going to take an extended period of time. That's what we call the regression and recoupment standard, okay? There are other standards under the IDEA and under the case law that interprets it that show that sometimes the nature and severity of a child's disability requires a different standard for that particular child. Long story short, there's a lot of misunderstanding about it, but why I'm bringing this up as back to school is if you keep hearing at your annual review for your child when you're asking for summer services that it's up to you as a parent to document any regression, which again is not the law, but if that's what you keep hearing and you don't want to go down the road of challenging that, then it's a good idea to maybe have some baseline data at the beginning of the summer. And now that you're back at school, where are we entering the school year? Because if you've got minimal extended school year services for your child, or perhaps none, and now we're going back to school in the fall, this might be a good time for some testing.
And I also think that when we're looking at regression, you need to break that up into categories. You need to look at what are the academic IEP goals. So that's, again, going back to knowing the IEP.
Right.
So if you know by the end of the school year, your student was supposed to know XYZ by the end of the school year, you may want to probe out during the summer, has he retained that information?
Right.
So that's an academic application to the regression standard. But the other one is to consider behaviors, perhaps social skill gains that have been made. So it's not just regression academically. And I think that's so important to mention because, as you know, many schools will sort of look
Focus
at education
on
on the academic achievement.
So an example I'll give, from personal experience is that I had a client who every single school year, at the end of the school year, they would work hard all year with consultants and the school district and the parents. All year they would work so hard at getting the student to be potty trained, to be able to use the toilet. And all year, by June, it would be in place, and the school district would always offer very minimal extended school year services. So every fall, this kid would be back to square one. And it was excellent evidence. It was a terrible situation, but excellent evidence that, yes, what you're providing over the summer is not adequate. If he's regressing in this important life skill every single summer, something's wrong. So what I would say is for academics, behavior, social, language, whatever the areas of deficit are for your child, there are standardized instruments, and many that the school typically does at the end of the school year anyway, that either you can ask your school district to repeat in the fall so that you have some baseline, or if necessary, ask somebody else to do them. So as an example, many schools will do something called a DRA to see where a kid is in reading at the end of the school year. Well, if a student ended the school year at a DRA reading level of 8 and started the school year at a 6, well, maybe you have evidence of regression over the summer, okay? Again, every case is different, every child is different, but this is a good time to revisit evaluations.
And just one more note on this. Make sure that if you're going to look at regression, you link that regression to IEP goals.
Right.
And also to think about the fact, going back to what you can set at place at the IEP team meeting prior to the summer, that you're actually saying, we're going to look at whether or not this student regresses, your child regresses over the summer, and putting into place, where did he end up? So that you're not sort of taking this situation out of left field, saying, I think he regressed, but you've set the situation up prior to the summer where everybody knows that's going to happen. I mean, that's the ideal situation, but looking at whether or not, looking at setting something like that up as you move forward.
Yeah, that's a very good idea.
Right.
Speaking of evaluations, if you feel for whatever reason, based on what's happened since the end of the previous school year, over the summer, or just perhaps, and this does happen, very soon into the school year, it's apparent there's a problem. I've had those unfortunate situations where day 3 of a child's school year, we know there's a problem. There's a real problem with the program, there's a real problem with the service provider, whatever it is, where things are going downhill fast. It may be time for a new evaluation, okay? And if that is the case, if there is a clear situation where there's been a change in performance or behavior that we now need updated evaluation, it might be time to ask for another IEP team meeting. And so even though you might have had one in the spring, you might have to say, I think we need another meeting to consider an evaluation of my child. Be on alert as a parent. I often see these things happen at those transition periods from elementary to middle school, middle to high school, when there's a real change in the program. But sometimes it happens within the same building where your child has perhaps been moved from a self-contained program into a mainstream program, or vice versa, and suddenly you're seeing dramatic changes in their performance or behavior.
Right, and that really leads us to the next category, which is meetings. Yeah. And I think this also falls under the category of organization, but look at, and knowing your IEP, look at the IEP and know, when is my annual review? When is my triennial?
Right.
And so to what you're saying, Jen, is you are now perhaps asking for a meeting that's out of turn with when your annual is and when the triennial is. And so you should know that you can always ask for an IEP team meeting to up an evaluation and make it sooner than was scheduled in your IEP.
So let's talk about that and break down those terms. Far be it for me to ever be breaking down terms, I tell you, the lawyer, but an annual review, what is that? That really is the date that your school district once a year must convene the IEP team to review and revise the IEP. And so it's usually called an annual review, meaning once a year is when we get together. For many students, it's the date they were found eligible. So if a child received early intervention services on their 3rd or 5th birthday, that may be the annual review date. For other students, it may be in the spring. Some school districts like to streamline and give everyone an annual review date in April or May. So it really will depend on your child. But that's what we mean by an annual review. A triennial evaluation is by federal law at least every 3 years, and we say at least because we really want to emphasize the fact that there
can happen sooner.
It could happen more often than every 3 years. Your school district is required to reevaluate the child to figure out whether or not the student remains eligible for special education services, under what category, and what the services should be, okay? So that has to happen at least every 3 years. If it's done right and in accordance with the law, it should be comprehensive, and it should be evaluating the child in all suspected areas of disability, which is essential because disabilities look different at different points of time. So sometimes what looked like attention deficit disorder in an elementary school age child might be looking more like
a learning disability
or an emotional disability as they're aging. We want updated testing. And so triennial testing is important because what happens, I see a lot, is it comes up quickly on people, including the school district. And so you have, let's say, your annual review at the end of the school year, and the district sort of says, okay, we're done with this case for a while. Let's say the annual review is May, and the triennial date is November 1st, okay, of the following school year. Well, school starts, everyone's running around getting settled, and before you know it, not only is November 1st the date by which all of the testing is supposed to be done and reviewed by an IEP team, but people sometimes just simply forget about it. And what I hate to see happen is the expedience of let's make sure we didn't mess up the timeline. So instead of doing a comprehensive evaluation, let's just do a records review, or let's just do this one test, because what are we going to learn about the child we don't know, which I hear a lot. And so you don't want to have a rushed triennial, especially for the younger students or even elementary, middle school age students. I can kind of see once you're in high school that there's sometimes less need for those quite comprehensive, but I still think you should do a full eval, and the law requires that. But take a look. If your IEP says that triennial is coming up, this might be a time to reach out and say, I understand the triennial is coming up. Should we be getting together as a team to talk about what that's going to be?
And one more note on doing a triennial. Beyond finding out if the student continues to be eligible under special education, I think the other purpose of it is to almost get that snapshot of where was the student 3 years ago, where is the student now? Has the student made progress? Has the student not made progress? Do we need to be going in a different direction here? So beyond, because many times I'll be in IEP team meetings and teams will say, well, it's just to find out if the student's eligible again. No, it's not.
No, it's not.
It's far more comprehensive than that.
It is.
Imagine it's like continuing to go to your doctor every year. Something can change in a year. So, it's also to get more information.
And there may be a good reason to move the triennial date. So it may, let's just say, as I gave the example, that you've got a November or October triennial date for a student who's at the end of their elementary education and is going to middle school. You may say as a team, let's move it to May so that we have the most current information about this child to plan for that middle school transition. Or you may say, let's move it to September because we want a lot of time to see how some of these changes may play out. But unfortunately, many school districts do say, let's just do it for the purpose of determining eligibility. We would certainly say, do a comprehensive evaluation as required by law and look at it not just to determine eligibility, but also to drive programming. That's really important.
And really we have just a couple of categories left. we could talk all night about
yes,
this, but we've tried to consolidate it into some real, take-home points here. If you have an older student, and so that could be any student really from 14 on, because transition services can begin as early as 14, and that means that your student is now having IEP goals with that long-term goal of what are we setting this student up to know to be successful for life after high school. And so if you have an older student, and typically students in late junior high school or high school, do I at this point need to also be involving my child in understanding his IEP?
Right.
Because at some point, and it's different for everyone, you have to know your child, you have to know your student, the age appropriateness of it, the developmental appropriateness of it. At what point do I need to involve my child in the IEP process? At what point does my child need to start coming to the IEP team meetings with me, understanding their IEP?
That's right, and it's an excellent question, and it's not a question that one can answer in a very simple way. The federal law says that what we call transition services, with Julie and I like to say transition with a capital T, and
Not
we have
between buildings.
Exactly, and we have a whole series on transition because it is so important.
Right.
Those are those services that need to be in place to transition a student from being in the eligibility of schools to adulthood, okay? And that can mean lots of things for lots of different people. But that's transition. And by federal law, transition goals and transition services must be in the student's IEP by their IEP when they turn 16. There are some states that have an earlier date than that say by 14. And one could argue that based on the unique needs of any child, it may need to be done earlier. But that's the federal
starting
requirement.
the process at least.
Absolutely. So that process is a long process. It sometimes requires outside agencies, consultants who aren't necessarily easy to get. And that question of, do I involve my child in the development of their IEP is a really good one. Your state will dictate at what age generally the student will be invited to the IEP team. But you should know that as your child's parent, you have the right, until they reach the age of majority, you have the right to decide whether they go. Now, whether you think it's a good idea for your child to be at their IEP team meeting is not a question that I feel is within my purview to answer. It's a very individualized question based on each family's decisions. There are some cases where I say, I don't advise it because I know I have an adolescent who's kind of resisting services that they really, really need, but they don't want. And I don't want my client, the parent, who's asking for these services to have that undermined by the student saying, I don't want to go. And the team saying, well, if he doesn't want to go, he doesn't necessarily get to make his decisions at this age. And then, other situations where the student is integrally involved and wants to absolutely participate. There are ways to get that participation in other fashions besides just attending the meeting or attending all of the meeting.
Right, and that's a really good point, because I think, and again, you're going to know this about your own child. But, if you don't think that your child should be at the whole meeting, you can either have your child at the beginning of the meeting for 5 minutes to say something that he or she may want to say. You could have your child at the meeting for the last 5 minutes of the meeting to say, this is what we've decided, what do you think?
Right, or what electives do you want to take next?
Right. But I think once your child has reached that age, just please be aware that your child can be a part of the process. And if you're we're going back to school, and if you're sort of fall into that category, know that that's something that you should be preparing for.
And if you do have a child who's able to articulate what is and is not working for him or her, and you feel has a good sense of their needs, it can be incredibly powerful, more powerful than the parent saying it, more powerful than sometimes an attorney saying it, is the student themselves saying, this isn't working for me. I feel I need this and that and the other thing. Sometimes I'll have my clients prepare a written statement that we can ask be attached to the IEP that expresses where the student is coming from. But as your student is getting older and getting into these transition services, there are some legalities that are going to come into play that you need to know about, and sometimes the beginning of the school year is a good time to know about it. And the reason is twofold. One is what we call the transfer of rights. What that means is, under the federal special education laws, the student, their rights are held by the parent until the student reaches the age of majority. Most states that it's 18, but it's not 18 in all states. So when your child reaches the age of majority, the IDA says that the child's rights transfer from the parent to the student directly, okay? 1 year prior to that occurring, by federal law, so for most students 17, the school district is required to explain to the student that the rights will be transferring to them, and there's a reason for that. Some students will not be legally competent to make their own decisions. Other students may be legally competent but don't want to make their own decisions, or they and their parents come to a decision that I still want my parents to act on my behalf because it's too tough for me to sit in a room of adults and advocate for myself. Lots of different circumstances. But if you want to obtain educational decision-making authority for your child who may be reaching the age of majority, you need to think about that well in advance, because if you're going to do it, there's legal proceedings that are required. If it is a situation where you're trying to have the student deemed not legally competent, you're going to go through your probate court or some other agency to try to get that legal decision-making authority. If it's a voluntary situation, you might want a power of attorney signed. So you don't want to be caught up very suddenly right before your child's 18th birthday or whatever the age of majority is, unprepared. And so take a look at that IEP beginning of the school year and think, when is he or she turning 18?
Absolutely. It's such great advice. And the other thing too is, if you have a student who perhaps is coming into their senior year, okay, and you're feeling, gee, you know what, maybe my son or daughter really shouldn't be exiting special education, check the IEP, that section in your IEP that talks about exit criteria, because I cannot tell you how many times I have been called by panicking parents who will say, literally like weeks before the end of the school year, I just found out that the check is marked for exiting. Right. And I don't think my child is ready to be exited. I really think we need to consider him or her perhaps through the age of 21. Right. You know,
and that's going to vary by state law, the age through which
Right.
your state requires special education
Right.
services. But there are really only 3 ways for you to stop getting special education services, okay, once you're found eligible from your school district, assuming you still live there and all those things. You either are exited because your performance or behavior no longer has your child meeting criteria. So there's no longer a disability that adversely impacts their education and that requires specialized instruction. So that's being exited because you don't need it anymore.
Right.
2, you receive a high school diploma. And I mean actually a diploma, not necessarily participating in the ceremony because you want to.
You physically receive
You get the diploma, okay?
Right.
Or 3, you age out, meaning that the state's law of how long you can receive services has been reached, and you've aged out of services. Those are the only 3 ways that you get out of services, okay? Unless, you know, a parent said, I don't want the services, which is a different thing. But those are the only ways that the school can say, you're no longer going to get services. I have the same experience you do, where parents, that senior year, that traditional senior year, can creep up more quickly than almost any school year in your child's education. And you don't want to be in a situation where you have to get an attorney or somebody who can invoke your rights to stop a graduation with a few weeks or a few days to turn it around. You want to be thinking about this and checking the exit criteria in back to school time.
That's a really big train to stop.
Oh, yes.
Okay, and I've been through it with parents, and check it now to make sure that the right box is checked.
Yes.
Also, just last thing on transition and sort of talking about students. If you do have a student who is not going to be graduated technically at the end of their senior year, and they are going to be eligible for services beyond their senior year of high school, check those transition goals that are in place. Every IEP is different according to the state.
It's supposed to be anyway.
Right, and then they're probably called something different in each state, but they have to be very specific statements made about under the area of vocation, under the area of leisure skills and activities, and adaptive skills, right? Those
Daily
are the 3 areas.
skills,
And check what those are, because now is the time to see, are those really where we're aiming? And so, you know, that's just a good tip for those transition age students.
Absolutely. Well, and speaking of students and getting older and students participating themselves, in addition to all the things that you as a parent can do to organize yourself and to document everything and to keep track of things and know what meetings to attend, back to school is also an important time to make sure that you're setting the child up for success. And there are lots of different ways to do that. For some people, you may have already started school, but for others, you may not be starting for another week or 2. For many of my clients, it's beneficial, and we usually do try to arrange this at the end of the previous school year, but it's not too late. makes a lot of students, sets their mind at ease to, in addition to any back to school orientation activities that the general population participates in, just to set up maybe meet the teacher, come back, see the classroom, something a little quieter and private for some students. Some students don't require this, but many students really, their minds are set at ease if they're able to have an opportunity to go and see the school and take a look around, sometimes even take a look at all of the classes they're going to be in and walk through. Those can be really relaxing and set students up for success.
Sure. And while I'm sure that we've covered a lot, and I'm sure there are things that we didn't cover, so we have come to the point where we are going to take some questions. We've received some questions from our Facebook page, which we're going to get started on. In case you'd like to submit a question, our Facebook page is facebook.com/YourSpedRights. And Jen, let's go right to the first question that we've already gotten on Facebook.
Okay, and we got some through our site itself too, through Your Special Education Rights. This is from Danielle in Illinois. She said, I asked for an IEP meeting for the first week of school, and I was told that my daughter's annual meeting wasn't until April. What should I do? I've heard this before. Okay.
Good one.
Yes. So while there is the annual review, parents are entitled to request an IEP team meeting at any point during the school year, even in the summer, and the school must convene it. And that is the bottom line. I mean, that is, there aren't a lot of bright line rules in special education law, unfortunately. This is a pretty bright line one. A parent has the absolute right to request the convening of an IEP team meeting. Parents are often told it's not his or her annual review, or we just had one. You know, I suppose there could be situations where a court or hearing officer would say, look, asking for one every 2 weeks is unreasonable. I mean, within reason. But if you ask for a meeting in the fall and it's not the child's annual review, it doesn't mean you can't have one, and your response should be, my understanding is I'm entitled to ask for an IEP team meeting at my request. Are you refusing that? And preferably you want to put that in writing.
Right. And you know, and as I say to parents, don't ask for an IEP team meeting for some frivolous reason that might be able to get solved or addressed in a regular meeting. But if it's something that's going to change the program, or you need to do an evaluation, or there's a really serious concern you need to get documented, then by all means you have the right to ask for an IEP team meeting. And you know, just on that note really quickly, Jen, you know, we're in the summer now. You know as well as I do that something we hear a lot is we don't hold IEP team meetings in the summer.
Yes, I hear
and you know, and what I'd say to that is it more difficult for a school to hold an IEP team meeting in the summer? Of course it is, because teachers are not under their contracts. They have to probably pay them privately or however they do that. But to know that you have the right to say, look, I will waive certain people being at the IEP team meeting if something is so pressing. And of course, if it's really a serious matter, you don't want to have people waived, and they've got to try to figure out a way to get people waived.
Because the federal regulations say that an appropriate IEP has to be in place by the first day of school. And that's the first day of school in your school district. And so if hypothetically you got the IEP and there's a major error from what you discussed at the meeting in the spring, and now you review it, and as an example, you thought your child was having a one-to-one paraprofessional and it's not in there, that IEP, for it to be appropriate, is supposed to be rectified by the first day of school. Otherwise, what's on paper is what was last offered before school started. And so you want to make sure you have that meeting before school starts if you can. So that was a very good question. Steve in Massachusetts says, I have no idea how to understand my child's IEP.
Well, this circles back to, but it circles back to parent training.
Absolutely.
And you have a right to understand your child's IEP, a fundamental right. And if you don't, you really need to. And that's where we sort of touched on this tonight. Go to your State Department of Special Education and see if they have a complimentary side-by-side comparison of explaining your IEP. And if they don't, certainly you pick up the phone or email someone on your team and say, you know, I really need a meeting to have this explained to me.
And the papers can be unbelievably confusing. Every state does it differently. In some states, every school district within the state does it differently. I read IEP forms, as do you, all day, every day, most of the school year. And even I sometimes get confused about where something is located on the forms. They sometimes seem like they're written in Greek. Don't be embarrassed that you don't understand them. I represent lawyers and educators and psychologists and psychiatrists who are parents who don't know how to read these forms. So please don't be ashamed about it. Some parents feel like I'm embarrassed that I didn't say anything at the meeting.
Right.
But you're multitasking a lot at the annual review meetings. You're listening, participating, writing notes, reading documents, perhaps reviewing evaluations. So don't be ashamed about it. It's a very common thing to not understand the documents.
There's no such thing as a stupid question.
That's right.
Right?
I know. Okay.
Well, this person, Megan from Ohio, says that at the end of the last school year, she really wanted her child to get involved in soccer, but she was told that her son cannot be involved in soccer. That doesn't quite seem legal. Any advice?
Okay. So,
Of course,
it's always
soccer begins right in the fall.
Yeah, in most places.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's always hard to say is something legal because you need to know a lot more information to know whether in a particular case is legal. But what I will say is this. The IDEA and the federal agencies that oversee and enforce the statute, as well as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is another special education accommodation statute, they have become more and more insistent on the fact that non-academic and extracurricular activities are part of a student's entitlement under the IDEA. And so a student, just because they have disabilities, can't be shut out from those kinds of activities just because they have a disability. They may require more support. It may be a situation where you say, look, I want my child to try out for the soccer team, and he or she may need a para with him or her to coach or to help make sure he or she understands the directions. Schools really don't like doing this. I'm going to say I think this is one of those frontiers that we still have to get much farther along.
And sometimes the coaches
are not progressive and they're thinking about this. And I also will hear this, and it's frustrating, but we can't guarantee that he or she's going to make the team, or we can't guarantee that she's going to be selected when she auditions for the play. And that's not what parents are looking for, nor is it really what the law requires.
Right.
What we're saying is you'll have to no pun intended, level the playing field. You cannot have a situation where because of a student's disability, they're shut out from the ability to participate and the opportunity to participate in non-academic and extracurricular activities.
And on a practical note, my advice or my recommendation regarding that would be to call an IEP team meeting and make it a formal request that you would like your son or daughter to be involved. In this case, it was soccer or whatever it could be any extracurricular activity for that matter. And there are all sorts of reasons why your child should be able to participate in all the things that other kids participate in. Now, having said that, you have to know your child, and you have to be realistic about what your expectations are, and if there are limitations, or everybody's different. But to at least bring that issue to the IEP team table, so that if there is going to be sort of a denial of those services, at least it's documented, and hopefully there won't be, and you as a team can figure out some way for your child to participate in an extracurricular activity.
And the back to school, the fall in many schools is the time where people join clubs and get involved in sports and those extracurriculars. And what's important is that this is one of those areas, Julie, where the discrimination can be very subtle. And it may not be as obvious as, well, your kid can't join the soccer team because he has a disability. It's rarely that direct. It's usually much more, you don't get the registration forms don't come home in your child's backpack, but everyone else gets them home. It's those kind of subtle, and you have to become almost like a detective as a parent sometimes to say, wait a minute, I thought these were coming out the first week in school. How come my child didn't get them because he or she may be in a different program? Those kinds of things.
That's a different systemic problem.
It's a problem. It is. And you might have to be, as I said, a little bit of a detective on it. But what I would say is this. One of the reasons that Congress and the federal government want this to be an area in which students are entitled to participate is because we want our students with disabilities to be part of the fabric of the community of the school. And for some students, that opportunity for interaction with non-disabled peers happens mostly in extracurricular activities, because in the school day, they may be removed from the mainstream a lot. And so, it may be the best opportunity for those kinds of interactions. So it's a very good question.
Right. I think there's another one.
Yeah, I know we had gotten a question through the site about how do we know, Anne asked this question, how do you know whether or not or when your child's teachers are receiving the IEP accommodations?
Such a great question.
This is a great question. Okay, so here's the thing.
Yeah.
When I read that question, I am assuming the regular ed teachers, because usually the special ed teachers are the case manager or might actually have the IEP. But let's just make that
not assume.
Let's not assume.
Okay, yeah.
I'll answer both.
Okay.
So assuming that we're talking about the regular ed teachers or the service providers who aren't the case manager.
Yeah.
The IDA doesn't require that every person working with a child have a copy of the child's IEP. Many parents assume that, but that's not the case. Clearly, any educator working with the student should be aware of the IEP and aware of the accommodations that need to be followed. Many times, the case manager is the person responsible for coordinating with all of the other service providers to make sure that they're aware of the accommodations the student should be receiving. Here's the problem. If they don't have a copy of that, that's pretty unlikely that every regular ed teacher is going to remember what every child's accommodations in their class may be, because they may have several students who have IEPs. So there are lots of ways to go about it. One is to simply ask the question at the IEP meeting where you plan for those accommodations, to say, how are the teachers going to be notified about the accommodations? Whose responsibility is it? And then follow up with again at the beginning of the school year, because again, could have been a different case manager. Someone could have forgotten about it. If there's no way that you're confident that people are being informed of the accommodations, sometimes it may require you resending it. This is the page that has the accommodations. Dear Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, the science and social studies teacher, I just wanted to make sure you understand Johnny's accommodation is that he needs extra time. This can be very important, especially if some accommodations for older students put more of the onus on the student to be the one who asks for the accommodation. So as a student's getting a little older, the student may have to go to the teacher and say, I need extra time on this assignment, which can be good for educational reasons to foster independence. But the kid may not be very good about it, or maybe shy or embarrassed about it. So as a parent, you may want to give the teacher a heads up. Johnny's a little embarrassed about it. Would you just ask him whether or not he needs extra help or extra time on these things? So you just want to make sure there's a link and that somebody is actually following through on this.
I would say that Johnny needs an IEP goal that's going to teach him how to
self-advocacy.
Yes.
So, I was thinking the same thing. And we certainly could add that. But as those things go along, these are practical realities.
But I do want to piggyback on something that you were saying, because Jen, in my experience, some parents don't want the regular ed teachers to see the IEP. They might want them to understand what the accommodations and modifications are. But then do they actually want them to see the IEP? And depending on your student's disability, you might have a student whose disability is very subtle, and your student doesn't want everybody knowing. So it's a balance. And I would say this is another really good area that you should sort of iron these things out through the IEP prior to school. But if you haven't, this is the time to get those types of things worked out.
Because there's nothing worse, and I see this particularly with high school and middle school students, than the first quarter grades come and the students failed 3 or 4 major academics, and in large part because the accommodations weren't followed, because the student was supposed to be given extra time or have modified grades or whatever, and now unringing that bell is very hard.
How many times have we been in IEP team meetings, or parents have reported to us that school teachers will say, I didn't even know there was accommodations and modifications.
Or worse,
this is the end of the school year.
Or worse, regular ed teachers who say, I don't care what the accommodations say. I've never given a kid extra time and I'm not going to do it. That's a real problem. I hate to say it, but there are some teachers who just flat out to refuse, and that becomes the problem for the special ed administration, not for you. That's not your problem. I mean, it's not your fault, but it can become your problem. But that's something where the administration for special education should step in and say, no, by federal law, you actually have to follow this document. So that's a very good question. But we suggest circling back with the team and making sure everyone has a really good understanding of it.
Are there any other questions? I actually think that we have pretty much talked about everything that we planned on discussing for back to school. There may be other issues we didn't cover, but we certainly tried to cover some important ones. And again, if there's any follow-up questions that you have, feel free to post them on our Facebook page, which is, again, facebook.com/yourspedrights.
Also on our website itself, yourspecialeducationrights.com, which is free for anyone who signs up as a member. There is a social media section of our site where we have groups that are started, and we always give the opportunity for someone to start a thread following one of our web shows to ask any questions that might have occurred to you later or whenever you're able to actually watch the web show. So we are so excited. We hope this is a great school year for you and your child, and thanks for watching.